It's time to get sexy, so watch Secular Sexuality Live Thursdays at 7 p.m. Central. Visit tiny.cc/YTSS and call into the show at 512-991-9242 or connect to the show online at tiny.cc/callsex.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of The Nonprofits, the show where we discuss news and topics of the day from a skeptical humanist perspective. My name is Cynthia McDonald, and today's topic is all about Roe v. Wade. This is going to be a deep dive episode, and we have a fabulous panel to really get in the weeds of it all. So we are going to break this up into segments. Our first segment is going to be called History's Pivot to Attack Roe v. Wade. Secondly, is going to be the slippery slope if Roe v. Wade is rolled back. And finally, we're going to wrap everything up with counterpoint to SCOTUS's leak. And I am joined, and I'm just going to go ahead and just introduce everyone, starting from my far left, one who needs no introduction, who has also made their rounds over the ACA shows. So we have joining us student Dr. Ben. Ben, how you doing?
Hey, doing all right. I'm excited to be back on this show, and especially with you, Cynthia, and our other guests. I'm really excited for this one.
Awesome sauce. Well, thank you for coming back and actually enjoying, well, I wasn't going to say enjoying, but, contributing rather to this topic. And then next, we also have MD Aware, also one of the hosts of Truth Wanted every Friday at 7 p.m. Central Time. MD Aware, how are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me on the show. I'm very excited. I wish I were here under better circumstances, though.
Exactly. I feel the same way, but I am very glad that you are here as well. And last but definitely not least, we also have yet another medical person that is joining us on this panel, Dr. Abby Hafer. Dr. Hafer, how are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on. I should actually say I teach human anatomy and physiology, so I'm not actually a medical doctor myself, but I teach people who want to go into healthcare.
Very good. Close enough.
Well, if you want to be made uncomfortable, I actually have a DPhil in zoology, so I can tell you all about why you are the way you are, rather than a little bit more of the nitty gritty.
Oh, dearie my. I should tell that. One day on the nonprofits, I'm going to tell the story of why I chose not to go into social service of healthcare instead of the medical services of healthcare. And it was all about anatomy and physiology, especially when I ran into the cadavers. Another show, guys.
Quite an experience.
Yeah, it was. It was.
Mm-hmm.
Just to say that I had a very overactive imagination. Now, this show is a product of the Atheist Community of Austin, a 501c3 nonprofit organization dedicated to the separation of religion and government and promoting positive atheism. And as with all of our shows, links to today's topics, and the news we discuss are available in the description below. And a reminder that if you want to come into the show prepared, you can check out the nonprofit's Facebook page every Friday night for a list of the articles ahead of time. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So let's go into our first segment in Student Dr. Ben, or as we refer to you in the green room, SBD. Why don't you go ahead and introduce everything?
So this first article kind of sets the stage for everything else that we're going to be talking about. This one is called How the Supreme Court Went from Cementing Abortion Rights in Roe v. Wade to Drafting Their Demise. This is from CNBC by Kevin Berninger. And this kind of goes into the whole history of Roe v. Wade and other court cases that are related to this, how we even got here. And I know Cynthia had a lot to cover on this. There's a lot of legal things here that I'm excited to hear your takes on.
Indeed, indeed. So, in this particular article, it does give a brief synopsis of Roe v. Wade and the different cases that dealt with abortion specifically. Just to kind of just like give like a, a synopsis. In a 1976 ruling in Planned Parenthood, and actually, Roe v. Wade was actually, I believe, cemented in 1973 based on the ruling utilizing the 14th Amendment about the right to privacy. And there were different legal cases that were tried after Roe v. Wade. And the first one was in 1976, ruling with Planned Parenthood versus Danforth. The court struck down parts of the Missouri abortion law requiring a woman seeking an abortion to provide a written consent of her spouse or her parent if she is under 18 or unmarried. Also in 1990, the court in Hodgins, oh my goodness, I can't talk. Hodgson versus Minnesota ruled that a state law provision denying abortion access to women under 18 until at least 48 hours after both her parents were notified was unconstitutional. In 1992, an opinion in Casey re-examined the fundamental tenets of the precedent established by Roe. The case itself, it's centered on a number of restrictive provisions within Pennsylvania's abortion law. Among them were requirements that doctors explain potential negative consequences to women seeking abortions, known as informed consent, and that those women notify their husbands before getting the procedure, with some exceptions. I really would just suggest like everyone just like really just like go ahead and just like read the article, because like I can go through all types of legalese and stuff like that, and I am not a lawyer. But one of the things that I do want to do is open it up to the panel, so that we can actually just really also just talk about some more of the history dealing with reproductive rights. I'm going to go ahead and start with you, Dr. Hafer, because you had a lot to say in your notes. So go ahead.
Right. Yeah, the articles that Cynthia was referring to give us a wonderful outline of the legal history of what happened, but not as much of the background as to sort of why things have happened the way they have in the past few years. So one of the things that I want to at least bring up is that in the legal community, there are many different legal theories of jurisprudence as they are known, one of which is called natural law. And although there are some people who will talk about natural law not having to do with a deity, usually natural law is basically Catholic doctrine in disguise. Natural law was invented by Thomas Aquinas. And it's just a case of kind of dressing, and I should say that other religious groups have kind of gotten on board with what natural law is about. But it's basically conservative religious doctrine, pretty much as invented by Thomas Aquinas, dressed up as both science and as a legal theory. And natural law doctrine of this sort is vehemently anti-abortion. It's also anti-same-sex marriage. It's profoundly unscientific. Don't let the word natural fool you on that one. In fact, that's kind of how I got involved in all of this, is because being the zoologist, I'm the one who tends to say nature. You want to tell me about nature? Allow me to tell you about nature instead. And we get into what really happens, both in the animal world, but also within the human body itself. So, as I said, natural law, there is a professor at Princeton Law School named Robert George. And he has been pushing natural law since the 1980s. He studied under a man named John Finnis at Oxford, and a fellow student of John Finnis's at Oxford was Neil Gorsuch, who sits on the Supreme Court right now. And so he thinks natural law is just great. And Dr. George has a great deal of influence in Washington. And he's been pushing this, but more to the point, giving it that sort of nice, secular seeming framing that you need to push religious doctrine around in our supposedly secular democracy. And as I said, Robert George is very good at kind of putting a nice, clean, shiny coat of paint over a religious doctrine. So that is one of the ways that we have gotten here, is because there's been a lot of background work trying to make this pass the smell test, basically. And at the same time, we've had the Republican Party that has been campaigning against abortion since at least the Reagan era. They've elected candidates based on this, and over the past 40 years, it's been effective. So, and I will also just say that one of the ways we got here, and this is going to tee things up for the other guests as well, is unfortunately, I think one of the mistakes that was made by the abortion rights side of things is that for various reasons, the abortion rights movement settled on one and only one argument in favor of abortion rights, the one that was really going to be pushed in court. And that was the argument that a woman has the right to choose what happens with her own body, which is a great argument, don't get me wrong, but it leaves a lot on the table. It means that all the non-scientific nonsense that you hear about, and here I'm queuing up my medical friends, heartbeat laws and unborn persons and things like that, those have gone unargued about, unopposed, in the court documents. And this is just leaving out reality and letting reality about what's actually going on in gestation and so on, that's just being left completely out of this argument. And that is one of the ways that I think we have lost the framing argument. I'll put it that way.
Oh, definitely. This is something that I've had countless debates with people about, especially, like, I hear people say, well, we use abortion in this colloquial sense. And like, okay, fine. But we are making medical arguments here. When you are asking to intervene within somebody else's healthcare, you are stepping into medical science. We have very specific definitions for what an abortion is within medicine. Especially, I like to cite the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology. But an abortion does not relate at all to the state of the gestation or the fetus. It's relating to the state of the pregnancy. And so we get the straw man argument of people saying, well, I'm not in favor of, terminating a fetus, ending the life of a fetus, but that was never the issue. And so we're missing each other on that.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's a little bit funny for me because for those who don't know, I'm a Canadian and I'm a physician, non-lawyer. It's hard for me to comment on the politics of the whole situation. But SDB is totally right. When we think about abortions in the medical sense, we're thinking about the state of the pregnancy, right? And typically, what you abort is not a fetus per se. What you abort is a pregnancy, and that can take several forms. And in Canada, we're very fortunate to be the only nation with zero criminal restrictions on abortions. There was a law in 1969 that legalized abortion only in cases where there was a threat to the woman's life and health, or the pregnant person's life and health. That was overturned, and the Supreme Court of Canada decided that the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees a right to life, liberty, and security of the person, which, for all intents and purposes, secured the right of a woman to, or again, a pregnant person, to receive an abortion of the pregnancy. And, you know, one of the places where I trained, where I went to medical school, was a notorious place in Canada where people would go for late term abortions. And what that often looked like was the induction of labor, right? The premature induction of labor, and it's all directed towards the goal of no longer being pregnant. So if you have, if you're really early in the pregnancy, you do perhaps a medical abortion, using your, abortifacient pills, and it causes the abortion to, or causes the products of conception to be expelled, and sometimes that's done in a procedural fashion. And at the far end, in late term abortions, you're basically just inducing birth, and the the fetus, the baby, whatever you want to call it, once it's out, if it's viable, then the medical team takes care of it, and the person who gave birth is free to like abdicate responsibility, put them up for adoption or not. But the focus is always on whether or not whether or not the pregnancy is continuing. It's never about the products of conception, the fetus, the infant, whatever. It's always centered on the pregnant person.
It's interesting because I know that like I've been having these conversations as of late on different platforms, and there is always this misconception concerning what is considered an actual human being when a person is pregnant versus not. Like the difference between an embryo versus a fetus, or even like how, let's just say, like Abrahamic religions would define life. And normally it's after it basically left the mother's womb. Like, life is at first breath. Even if we look at Genesis, the first chapter of Genesis, and the second chapter of Genesis, when God saw that Adam was lonely and decided to put him to sleep and take a rib or a side of him and then breathe life into said thing. and then Adam ended up calling it or woman, right? And but it's interesting that it was after that portion left Adam. So Adam wasn't necessarily carrying any additional parts of himself any longer. It was completely separate and able to live on its own. So I would love for any of you all who want to jump in to really talk about the differences between when we're talking about stages of pregnancy versus and then like when like this collection, this multicellular collection of parts versus when it goes into actually becoming a human being. Whoever wants to take it.
It's a bit tricky, right? Because the law is all about, like, the law doesn't apply to humans or life per se, right? Usually the law applies to a thing called a person, right? Air quotes person, which is like a legally defined entity. It's not a scientific definition, right? And the law can define a person as sort of whatever. So I think in some cases, like corporations can be considered persons, right, for example, which, from a scientific perspective is nonsense. So it makes the fact that abortion laws are not scientifically founded or medically founded makes the whole thing very confusing and sort of like arbitrary seeming to me. With respect to your question, Cynthia, and I'd love to get Dr. Hafer's opinions on this. I think that the designation of when the fetus is alive, air quotes, is sort of meaningless. Like, I don't think it really matters at all. I would say that, like, if you have a person who's pregnant and they're like 38 plus 5 days, for instance, 38 weeks plus 5 days, almost at term, I'm willing to say that that is a human life. And I don't really have any qualms with that. And it doesn't affect my stance on abortion at all. I'm still pro-choice. So I don't think that, like, to me, the question of whether or not, at what point a fetus, an embryo, a zygote becomes a human, that doesn't really factor into my decision making. But I love to hear both Dr. Hafer's and SDB's opinions on this.
Yes, please.
Well, I'm going to jump in with just a few notes here, because the whole framing of the argument gets to be so confusing. So I'm going to start with one frame that is total nonsense, which is the comment or the argument that life begins at conception. Now, I'm a biologist. Life began 3.7 billion years ago. It has been one continuous line of life ever since. The sperm were alive, the egg were alive, both parents were alive, the grandparents, all the way back to the beginning of life. They were all alive. It is one continuous chain of living. So does life begin at conception? No, life's been going on a long time. What begins at conception is a brand new piece of DNA. And DNA is a molecule. And you can't murder a molecule. And so when you hear life begins at conception, you have to stop right there, and you basically say, this framing is incorrect. It's been life since life began. What you're asking is, when did this unique piece of DNA come into existence, and should that matter, and why does it matter, if it matters? So, as I said, that is just one thing to stop as soon as they start. And related to that, I'm going to say, and I'm now not talking about near term. I can make lots of arguments about competing rights. But in general, do not let someone refer to an embryo as an unborn person, because embryos are ungestated, not unborn. Born means exiting the uterus. All those different procedures result in the fetus leaving the uterus, right? So, in fact, they're not, they admit, by the fact that they oppose abortion, that fetuses are not unborn persons, because the birthing, if you will, is still taking place. What's not happening is further gestation. And gestation takes time and work and a lot of physiological changes within the woman's body. And they are deliberately, and this is done a lot by, in fact, the natural law writers, they completely ignore the fact that gestation is necessary. And I like to liken it to making bread. That basically, if you have a sack of flour and a recipe and a few other ingredients on your kitchen counter, you do not have bread. Bread takes the combining of a lot of ingredients in just the right ratios and being worked in various ways. And there's time when lots of various biological processes take place. There is then further biological processes that take place in the oven and in human gestation, that is still a very, very active time. And my point here is that we do not refer to a recipe on the table, which is basically the DNA. We do not refer to that as unde-ovened bread, because the concept is ridiculous.
Unbaked.
It's not just unbaked, it's unde-ovened, because that's the
Unde-ovened.
important part, is coming out of the oven, right? I mean, that's what they're all head up about, is the fact that something is coming out of the oven. We do not refer to, as I said, a recipe and various ingredients on the kitchen counter as unde-ovened bread, because it's a ridiculous way to put it. And it's the same thing with unborn persons.
Mm-hmm.
They are ungestated. And if you don't talk about gestation, you're not really talking about pregnancy. You're not really talking about reality.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, Dr. Hafer. Sorry, I know SDB.
Go ahead,
wanna
go
jump
ahead.
in. I just want to ask. So, I get what you're saying. Like, life began 3.7 billion years ago, etc. I totally am on board. But I think you're almost focusing on the semantics of the argument. I think if we were to have a pro-lifer in this room with us, they would say, okay, well, I don't mean life, I mean an individual new person, right? And it's not, if I put my pro-lifer hat on, if I had one, I would say, well, it's not the DNA that's special, right? Because you can get DNA from, like, do a biopsy of any, tissue in my body, and you'll get my DNA. I don't really care about that. And it's not life in general that I necessarily think is valuable, because I, eat other living organisms for, to survive. So that's not what I think is important. It's this other thing, which the law has, in a manner uninformed by science, because it, stretches back before the modern scientific methods. What I think the law is trying to point to is this notion of persons, and that's what I think most people are trying to grasp. And I think we lack right now a good scientific definition of what it is to be a person, and to have, therefore, the, all of the rights that we would extend to the people around us. And I think that that's where the conversation has to go scientifically, but it's hard, because then you're almost approaching the is-ought gap, right? It's like, well, we have all these scientific facts, but how do we turn that into, like, sort of a societal moral judgment on who should be extended what rights, and what even who means, right? Because that's kind of the discussion, is when does one piece of life with maybe these different properties like DNA, when does it become a separate, independent thing with its own, its own rights and things like that? Well, what do you think? Do you think that we're missing something scientifically to grasp what people generally mean when they talk about a person?
Well, I think you have actually just, framed things beautifully, because that's my point. The language that is being used by the anti-abortion movement is deliberately deceiving. It's not, when does life begin? I don't think anybody's arguing that it isn't alive. The question is it a person, and are there competing rights? And, getting back to the Supreme Court case or the Supreme Court leaked decision, where they are talking about abortion cases from far, far back in legal history. One of the things that I like to point out is that cases from before, I'm going to say, the 1970s, regarding women versus anything, whether it's a fetus or anything else, are from a time when women were not recognized as having full human rights in the United States. It wasn't until the 1970s, I think it was, that women could even have a credit card in their own name.
Right.
And you go further back, and there were ever fewer. The further back you go, there are ever fewer rights that men have that women did not. And so if you are going in those older cases, what you were doing is you were comparing the rights of the gestating embryo, which were dubious, but maybe you could talk about them, particularly since they might be a man's property, versus the dubious rights of the woman. And when women were married, they very often were considered to more or less disappear legally, because the husband and wife became one unit led by the husband. So, any case older than about, say, 1970, you are comparing the kind of not terribly existent human rights of a woman versus the perhaps existent, as they were seen at the time, rights of the gestating embryo. And so you get a very lopsided balancing of rights under those circumstances. Whereas now that women are finally recognized as being people, it's a very different conversation, and it should be a very different conversation. So referring to older legal decisions, I think, is kind of ridiculous, because, as I said, if we're going to talk about balancing rights, we have to talk about them in our current context.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
And I'm sorry. I was just going to say, Ben, I would like for you to go ahead and just wrap up this particular segment with your thoughts, and then we're going to move on to the next one. But go ahead.
Yeah, so kind of this is going back to addressing Cynthia's question a little bit, as well as kind of tying this in. But I think we are seeing a lot of shifting the goalposts, especially from the legal side. People at first saying, well, we care about viability, so we're going to make it 24 weeks. And then people are moving earlier and earlier saying, no, well, but viability, we're going to call it 20 weeks now. We're going to call it adding in heartbeat bills 6 weeks. And so you have this moving of what defines viability, which isn't even a great way to approach it, because when we're talking about viability, we're just talking about the likelihood of survival if the gestation were to be removed from the uterus. And that has changed over time, seeing that with the current technology and the neonatal care that we have, sure, as you approach 34 weeks, you're much more likely to survive. But before the modern era, 34 weeks might not have been as viable. So it's all probabilities and likelihoods and not a set definition. But at the same time, we need to make sure that when we're talking about this, that we're not letting people shift the goalpost so much to where they can just assign viability to wherever they want.
Yeah, it's a totally technological definition, right? Like you were alluding to, Ben. We could, in 5 years, someone could invent some machine that keeps, preemies alive for months, starting at 6 weeks, for instance, right? And then they're like, oh, they're viable. Well, theoretically viable is not the same, right? And doesn't have any biological definition.
And furthermore, if it were viable outside the body, why not just put it there? If that's what people, if that's what the anti-abortion movement really wants, why are they opposed to abortion then? It could be gestated that far and then put into an incubator.
Right.
Right. And just before we just move on, I just want to give a quick bit of history concerning even how the religious right actually ended up picking up abortion as I would just say a political dog whistle. And I know, Dr. Hafer, you alluded to it specifically with Ronald Reagan and his run for office back in 1980. And I remember that. I do. I remember that. And how basically he ran on overturning Roe v. Wade. And it was kind of interesting that when the decision came down from from the court that Roe v. Wade was a thing, and right to privacy, and now you can't overrule abortion. Uh, in actuality, the religious right did not have an issue with that. Matter of fact, in 1971, the Southern Baptist Convention, which is the largest uh, Protestant denomination in the United States, passed a resolution calling to legalize abortion. And when the Roe decision was handed down, some evangelicals actually applauded the ruling as marking an appropriate distinction between personal morality and public policy. However, about 14 years later, claimed that opposition to abortion, when the catalyst for political activism, Jerry Falwell, did not preach his first anti abortion sermon until February of 1978, more than 5 years after Roe. And why did he do that? I'll tell you why. Because Falwell had an academy. He had, like, I believe it's called Liberty University, if I'm not mistaken, where they were sued back in the late 1960s because they did not allow other minorities, specifically Black people, to actually become students at the university, and they were actually denied their tax exemption rights, or tax exemption status rather, by the IRS in attempts to actually force integration. And since integration was overturned in 1954 with Brown versus the Board of Education, they knew that segregation was not a way for them to utilize that particular issue for them to be able to rally other Christian right evangelicals in order for them to actually counter their cause. So the decision was to get on the Catholic train and make it abortion. And it's kind of interesting how people like the right per se likes to use the anti-abortion rhetoric to say that it's all about life. We don't want to kill any more babies. But in actuality, that was not the case with them, not even 50 years ago. So we're going to move right along, people. But before we do, I'm going to scroll down and say thank you to both our veteran viewers for getting us up to 10.8 thousand plus subscribers. So if you are watching us now and you haven't subscribed yet, please get on that. And once you subscribe, hit the like button and ring the bell so you always know when a new Nonprofits episode premieres, like every Sunday at 3 p.m. Central. But you already knew that. Did you all know that? Well, now you know. How about that? And don't forget to share the link to our channel with your friends and your family members and your coworkers, anybody and everybody. And let's get the word out so that we can also help our fundraisers. And I don't know if you all know this, but if you are not aware, the Atheist Community of Austin has another YouTube channel. So check out the Atheist Experience Network, a channel where you can find all ACA shows in podcast form. Subscribe at tiny.cc/AEN podcast to listen to episodes of the Nonprofits, the Atheist Experience, Secular Sexuality, Truth Wanted, and all of our other ACA shows so you don't miss a single episode. All right. So let's go ahead and go into our next segment. And MD Aware, you're going to be bringing us into that. Please.
Fantastic. So segment 2 is called Slippery Slope if Roe v. Wade is rolled back. The article in question here is called Here's What Could Happen If Roe v. Wade is Overturned. It's by Joe Hernandez at NPR. And really what this article focuses on is the fact that there have been, because Roe v. Wade has been in place, it has given states the opportunity to pass all sorts of laws concerning abortion without really giving thought to the consequences of those laws, because they knew that these were not going to be, enforceable, essentially, because Roe v. Wade was in place. So essentially, they could pass a whole bunch of these laws that had various draconian restrictions on the right to have an abortion, and not have to worry about the consequences of them or the practicalities of it, or even enforcement. But suddenly, if Roe v. Wade is now being rolled back, suddenly you have a whole bunch of states that have these so-called trigger laws in place, meaning that as soon as Roe v. Wade is overturned, then suddenly abortion will be illegal in a number of states. It's according to this, at least 20 states. There's going to be some form of limitation on the right to pursue an abortion and to receive an abortion. And so this has some very interesting potential consequences, and it's a lot of those cases where the state laws are talking about life beginning at conception, for instance, and that the life must be protected from that point on, because that's very interesting. And I'm sure SDB will have some things to say about this as well. But there are issues around the fact that some of our birth control methods, like intrauterine devices, for instance, don't actually prevent the conception. They prevent implantation of the embryo into the uterus. And so, in theory, IUDs are going to be illegal in some of these places. And that's a form of, contraception that's widely used. There's also issues around things like ectopic pregnancies. So an ectopic pregnancy is when the embryo implants in an area outside of the uterus. It's very commonly in the fallopian tube that sort of connects the ovary to the uterus. And in ectopic pregnancy, the fetus is essentially never viable. There's no potential for a future life. There's no potential for a healthy infant from that pregnancy. And yet, because life begins at conception, these laws would require that the pregnant person carry that to its natural conclusion, which would be universally life-threatening for the pregnant person and lethal for the pregnancy. And so there's a lot of these issues that that come up because of this, because of these trigger laws that were not put in place in a well thought out fashion. And, no one's really given them the proper thought to how they would be enforced and what the consequences would be. And so I think that if Roe v. Wade is overturned and some of these trigger laws go into effect, there's going to be a lot of political backlash, I imagine, when the first few women die of, hemorrhage from an ectopic pregnancy that they could not get removed, right? That they could not have, because that would constitute an abortion, an illegal abortion, because life began at conception, right? And so I think this is something that we really need to, I'd like to hear everyone's opinions on it. But I think that this is going to pose a lot of problems, both medically and legally and politically, for some of the people who have campaigned for those laws to go into effect.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of issues, especially within the OBGYN circles, that I'm not going into OBGYN, but I'm very terrified for a lot of my friends who are, because on the one hand, like we're legally bound to uphold the pillars of medical ethics. So we're talking beneficence, non-maleficence, autonomy, and justice. And you have abortion falls into all of those categories. So you have these ethics that you have to follow, but then now you're simultaneously legally bound to break them, because like we're talking about this ectopic pregnancy, or another example that I like to use is the inevitable abortion, where you have a rupture of membranes prior to 20 weeks, where you might have a heartbeat and you might have a viable gestation that has to be removed, because otherwise you're going to get sepsis. So, like, you have somebody coming to you who is in distress and who needs help. And on the one hand, you want to help them, but you know that if you do, you might be going to prison for helping. But then if you don't, sure, you avoid prison, but now you've neglected somebody that you had a duty to help. So this is in conflict with everything that we're taught, and it violates this relationship between the doctor and the patient. And I think, like, and it's interesting too that this is so criminalized, as opposed to in other. And I'm not lumping this in with malpractice, but if this were to be treated as malpractice, like, you're not usually going to a criminal trial for malpractice. It's handled in with the medical boards and with a civil trial. So it's interesting that this is a criminal offense that can get you a felony charge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't envy American physicians at this point.
Yeah. Dr. Hafer, I wanted you to also chime in, and I wanted to speak a bit on the whole criminality of a lot of these particular trigger laws. Go ahead.
Well, and as you mentioned before, some of this has been political. That is to say, the laws were put into effect by politicians who could run on these things without having to worry about the consequences to actual human beings. Mm-hmm. So, they could run on it and they could get their base all excited by it. But on the other hand, they didn't have to really deal with it. It was just kind of this this thing that they could talk about that essentially had no real consequences. So they could be as extreme as they wanted to be, and that just got their base excited. So there are all these laws on the books that were put there largely to make the legislators look good in the eyes of certain extreme portions of their constituency. And now they may actually wind up going into effect. And yeah, you're going to have the problem that people are going to die. I mean, I'm not joking when I say that, and I'm not exaggerating. If you have an ectopic pregnancy, if it is not dealt with medically, if the implanted fetus is not removed, basically the woman is going to die. And the fetus is doomed. I'll say that again. It's doomed from the start. The moment it implants on a fallopian tube, it is doomed. So there aren't even competing interests there, but this is not going to matter with these trigger laws.
Yeah. I pulled up a few stats specifically speaking on maternal and infant mortality rates in the United States. And amongst the other developing countries, the United States is like the worst. For a highly industrialized, wealthy nation, our infant and maternal mortality rate is abysmal. And I can just even think about having reproductive rights actually overturned in certain states, that it's going to only get worse. You all are familiar with the Guttmacher Institute, and they actually conducted a study to actually gauge the reasons why most people get abortions. And about 60% of people who actually choose to get abortions were about 200% of the federal poverty line, including 30% who were living in poverty, and 31% of the respondents were Black, African American, and 19% were Latine or Hispanic. And I was even looking at like this whole issue concerning like who these trigger laws would affect adversely the most, and it's definitely going to be poor people. And people who happen to be in largely marginalized groups are going to see the worst effect of it. And if we talk about criminalization, a lot of these particular trigger laws, like that we have seen in Texas and Mississippi, and I believe Idaho, I believe Arizona passed one not too long ago. Um, there is a there is a punishment that is going to be ensued for people who either choose an abortion or even have like the a semblance of helping somebody to get an abortion.
Mhm.
So right now, we have already the highest prison population in the world in the United States. Um, and can you just imagine, like, how the prison population actually becoming even more so an issue just because of these particular laws? Only because a person said that I don't have the resources to carry my pregnancy to term. And even part of some of my other, discourses that I had for people who happen to be pro-life, air quotes, was saying about, well, what about adoption? Um, I don't know if anyone is familiar with the adoption rates in the United States, but they're kind of shitty too. Yeah, we're more than 5 minutes in, so I can cuss. So yeah, they're very shitty. And we even seen where African American children are actually less likely to be adopted out and actually stay in the system longer than any other group of children. And and even like if you're even looking at the wealth gap right now, there's been a lot of talk in the news about like the racial wealth gap, and even if looking at Black women, they're about 90%. There's a 90% wealth gap between Black women and white men in the United States right now. So and even going back to even like what you all were talking about specifically about topical pregnancies and even like other issues concerning the mother's health, the mother's health that could be in jeopardy if they happen to develop a pregnancy that is not viable for the infant or themselves. A lot of the trigger laws do not keep those things in mind. So they are definitely based on things that are not socially nor scientifically viable. And
The
yeah, I
thing
need
that
to
I
breathe.
find so
Okay.
confusing is
Mhm.
that there's a lot of these laws, and sorry, there's a lot of these laws, and then when you read the article, like even the one that we are talking about today, they'll say something like, except in cases of rape and incest, or
Mhm.
this law doesn't even make exceptions for rape and incest,
Right.
as though that makes it like, as though that constitutes something different, right? It's like on one side, these trigger laws are saying like, no, it's a life, it has inherent value, it like we can't violate that, except if it's the product of a rape or incestuous relationship. Like, I don't understand why that fact would alter the value in their eyes of the product of it,
Mhm.
right? Like these laws don't even make internal sense. Like they're not even internally consistent to me. It's that I find like so bizarre.
Well, I can answer the question for you if you want. It's because with rape and incest, it was not a woman choosing to have
Right.
sex.
Mhm.
Right.
So this is all about punishing women for
Right.
having sex. Um,
Mhm.
and
But
so the
that's not what
only
they say it's about,
oh,
right?
Oh
that's why
yeah.
I'm
So
pointing it out.
yeah, so it's totally like they're betraying their true motivation by
Right,
putting in those sort of those caveats.
And
right.
can I
Go right
and
ahead,
I
sure.
and can
Yeah,
I chime in as well? Like,
yes,
because I
please.
don't want to forget too that this doesn't only impact women. Like, I'm a trans man. This
Mhm.
impacts the trans community, and we're often left out of this conversation. And it's really sad, and it affects us, trans men and non-binary people in ways that are not easily thought of, because if you haven't lived as one of us, it's kind of difficult. But pregnancy requires the cessation of testosterone therapy because it is a teratogen. So you're asking somebody to stop their gender affirming care, and which causes more dysphoria, but then also losing the ability to go stealth in men's spaces. If you look like a man and you also look very pregnant, that can be dangerous to go into, because you're not allowed in women's spaces. You're not allowed
Right.
in men's spaces now.
Right.
Like, you don't have a space, and you could very well be the target of violence in that case.
Yeah, and I actually have seen that to be the case of where persons, who happen just to have a uterus, if they happen to be masculine presenting, yet they're pregnant, and they chose, like, I'm going to actually have a baby with myself and my partner, then from other sides, especially like from cisgender heterosexual men, it's a problem, and it can definitely be the case of a lot of violence to be exacted upon that particular group of people. So these laws in of itself don't even, as Ben just mentioned, even keep any of those things into consideration. It's in all in all, they're just very extremely dangerous. And it's kind of even interesting, like to your point, Dr. Hafer, when you were saying that well, that we're just going to actually just punish women, or when women presenting people to because you decide to have sex, right? Even if you are actually having sex and you're not necessarily married, or if you, happen to not necessarily have a condom at that particular time or whatever, there's still like this whole punishment again to those who are saying that, okay, yeah, I'm going to have sex, but because I guess it's not in this particular confined of a particular institution, is wrong. I don't know. I want to open that up to the floor and just kind of get your thoughts on that, everyone.
Well, the short version is that conservative Christians are frightened out of their minds by happy female sexuality. They don't like it. They want it to be owned by a man, basically, and be in the service of a man. And so, basically, women having sex for fun is not something they want to think about. And then all of the other sort of, not in service of a heterosexual man aspects of this, whether it's a trans man or whatever, all of those things are kind of the same in the same pot that way, because it is not, women having sex specifically so as to serve a man and give him children. And anything that isn't that is just something that's considered frightening and, well, frankly, wrong. And
Right,
so
it
they
comes
don't
back
want
to
it.
what you were saying about like natural law, right? That seems very rooted in Abrahamic faith traditions.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And yeah, we're definitely back to the natural law, folks. That is to say, sort of conservative, originally Catholic, but as I said, very much supported now by conservative Protestants as well. This is conservative Catholic dogma. And these folks are also against LGBTQ rights and same sex marriage and everything else like that. If you ever want to read a document that is simultaneously really insulting to your intelligence and very frightening, read the Manhattan Declaration, which was again written by this guy, Dr. Robert George, who's at Princeton. And if you read it, it's all about all the things we would expect about same sex marriage and abortion and all of these kinds of things. And it basically is presenting it as simultaneously religious, but no, not really religious. Look, we're busy being secular. Um, but it's also an example of just how poor their reasoning actually is. It's kind of for that reason that I recommend it, because it is a document that has been very influential. But when you look at how bad their arguments actually are, it's kind of frightening that they have that much power. It talks about how women should not be forced to have abortions, for example. Well, we are all agreed that women should not be forced to have abortions, but they are essentially making this very paternalistic argument that that no woman would decide to have an abortion if she were not forced in some way or another. So you kind of get the idea here. It's basically women as not possessing agency.
Mm.
And anyway, this is what natural law is about, and it is unfortunately far too powerful as a legal theory in our country.
Mm. Ben, how about you? You look like you're stirring on my far left.
Oh no, I'm just kind of taking stuff in, and this is all like it's keeping people down, and I want to laugh at the fact that people are so insecure about other people, existing, but at the same time, like, why? Like, why are you trying so hard to make us all miserable? And like going back to what Cynthia was saying about cost being such a big factor, it really is. Like poverty is huge in this. And this, like preventing people from being in charge of their pregnancy is keeping people poor. And like thinking about even if this were to like go to the States, like you have some people with a lot of financial privilege who might be able to overcome some of those barriers, like people crossing state lines to be able to get terminations. But again, that's a lot of cost that not a lot of people have. The cost of prenatal care is really high because you have to be constantly monitored. Cost of delivery, cost of postpartum care, cost of your pediatrician for that entire childhood period, the cost of lost income due to like if you have to go on leave and if your job doesn't provide you with parental leave, which many don't, you're losing income there. And the cost of, let's say you were a high risk pregnancy, or even if you're not necessarily high risk right away, but something happens, that's more medical bills for complications of said pregnancy. So there's no way for someone without that privilege to win here.
Yeah.
Right, and I'm just going to add in that it turns out, surprise, surprise, that women are actually very good judges of when they can support a pregnancy and when they can support and raise a child. And this is something that is being deliberately ignored. Again, is the whole idea of female agency. It's not only keeping people poor, but women, it's not allowing women to make decisions, not just about their bodies, but about their lives. And as I said, and as you have pointed out, where poverty is concerned and so on, women are actually pretty good at figuring out what they need to do.
I wanted to go back to that piece when you were talking about prenatal care, Ben. I was actually discussing this episode with my mom before we were going to record last night, and I was telling her about all the different research that I was just doing, just so that I can actually sound like that I can string two sentences together with all these medical people, and it kind of brought up some, I guess, like some old ghost, specifically with me. I remember I was in 2007, early 2008. I was pregnant, and I was with the father for a while, but the relationship was very toxic. So I decided to leave the relationship, And 2 weeks later, I found out that I was pregnant. And I did mull around possibly terminating the pregnancy because I did not want to have anything to do with the father. And I knew that if I had the child, that would happen. Now, I ultimately decided not to terminate the pregnancy. I would also like to say at that particular time I was a theist, and but I ended up losing the child anyway. And the funny thing about it was is that I had insurance. I was working. I had a pretty decent job, and I was high risk at the time, and I was actually seeing a doctor on the regular basis to monitor me while I was going through my pregnancy. The night before I actually miscarried, I had an appointment with the doctor, and they told me that they could not hear a heartbeat, but they sent me home. The next day, I started to get very dizzy. I was throwing up blood, and I had to be taken to the emergency room right away. I waited in the emergency room for over 8 hours before I saw a doctor. By that time, I was taken to the back. The baby was, as we know, was dead, and or the fetus was dead, and it fell out while I was by myself, not with a doctor. I had to scream for a nurse to help me, so that they can actually make me give birth right then to a dead fetus. And I don't necessarily think, and that happens a lot, especially to Black women in the United States. So this is not a story that is not unfounded from a lot of women, especially Black women who happen to be pregnant, even if they have good jobs, even if they have a decent education or anything like that. As I stated before, the infant and maternal mortality rates in the United States is absolutely abysmal, and because we still have issues concerning implicit bias and racism also in the healthcare system. And actually doing this particular portion of all the rolling back that Roe v. Wade is going to happen to do, or the damage is going to do, per se, especially when you're looking at the attack on abortion pills, attack on contraception, because contraception, like IUDs and and pills, are not always just so that you don't get pregnant. A lot of times they actually are put in place to fix issues that's going on in a person's body. Um, it's going to be a point where stuff like this is going to be even more prevalent, and it's really really messed up that it's not something that is being really discussed in the way that it should be, at least not in the lawmaker's chair. And before we move on, I just want to get everyone's final thoughts, and then we're going to go on to our final segment. I'm going to start with you, Dr. Hafer, then MD Aware, and then student Dr. Ben.
Well, I mean, I'm very moved by what you had to say there. And this is absolutely the case that, all of these things work together. So, and poverty is going to be a complicating factor at every single step in a person's pregnancy and in a person's ability to raise their child. Um, or not raise their child, but it's going to complicate absolutely every step of the journey. It's going to complicate um, whether, as student Dr. Ben was saying, whether they can travel out of state if they want to terminate. But it's going to complicate getting proper prenatal care. It's going to complicate getting housing. It's going to complicate being able to further your education. All those things wind up adding up. Um, and this is definitely going to wind up keeping a lot of people in poverty. And, I can say, as someone who teaches human anatomy and physiology, I know the people who try to educate their way out of poverty. by going into healthcare, taking anatomy and physiology, and then they can go on and be accepted into a nursing program, or into lots of other healthcare programs. And I see the struggles that people go through to do this. And all of those different things, they are in principle, all of these different sort of things that complicate things are in principle surmountable. But the more that you put in place, the harder the more obstacles there are in somebody's life, the more it's going to be hard to get yourself and your family out of poverty. And that's just the reality of the situation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I am aware.
I mean, I don't have a lot to add, except I wish I could say that I was surprised that a move like this was going to disproportionately affect the traditionally marginalized populations, but I'm really not surprised by that, right? It just reaffirms to me the need for things like medical care to be socialized. And again, I'm speaking from the context of a Canadian physician who works in a socialized medical system, which is not perfect by any means. And we still have the challenges that you alluded to, Cynthia, about issues with racial biases in the way people are managed, and gender biases in the way people are managed. But I mean, I think that if a similar thing were to happen in Canada, the effects would be not as significant, I would hope, because the financial barriers would be less. I mean, I can't imagine the fear that people in the States are feeling. I imagine they're feeling very, very trapped and betrayed. And I don't know. All I can do is express my sympathy. And if I were qualified, I'd open my doors to perform abortions on whoever wanted to make the trek north. But that's not my field.
I got you. Thank you. And finally, Ben.
I'm just gonna keep this short and sweet, but this is not an isolated issue. There's intersectionality with all of this, and we can't forget that. So just because you don't like one particular thing, think through the consequences that it's going to have on everybody else, because it's unlikely to only affect one thing.
Agreed. And on that note, people, we're going to go ahead and take a break from our conversation. And if you didn't tune into the other ACA shows last week, here is what you missed.
I speak for no one but myself. That comes from owning the messages that I've ingested from society about men's discomfort with women, with their demand that women be a certain way in order to be consumable. But I'm not a goddamn edible.
That's kind of like the world of evangelicalism. It's, you're dating, and then right away they're like, when are you getting married? And then as soon as you're married, when are you having kids? And you're like, I'm 19.
Slow down. This isn't a Monty Python sketch.
I'm not all about limiting free speech, but I'm definitely all about not promoting violence and calling for the harm or death of others. And that is absolutely what this is. You're firing up a congregation of people with hate speech.
I find it difficult to believe that anybody thinks that we don't actually exist. And it's an unfalsifiable claim, which is it's fantastic for mental masturbation, especially if you've had a couple of joints.
Did it come out of nowhere?
It was put there by humans. Humans drew lines on a map.
Israelite
that doesn't mean
people
God's real.
Believe something. They're a nation on the planet.
Yeah. Does that make it true?
And we are back. Before we go into our final segment, just have a few things to say. First off, you know that you can become a member of the channel for as little as 99 cents a month. So make sure that you click the join button below the video, and this will give you access to special chat emojis. And also, we have a brand new store. So visit tiny.cc/merch ACA or tiny.cc/merch ACA to get your favorite items like t-shirts, hoodies, and coffee mugs. And you can check out the new items like beanies, phone cases, and tote bags. And all ACA shows feature a special limited edition item for each month. So be sure to check out the store for nonprofits merch and merch from our other shows. And we are about to go ahead and go into our final segment. Ben, you're going to lead us into this one, so take it away.
All right. So this segment is counterpoint to the SCOTUS leak. Biden pledges to try to enshrine Roe into law if court strikes down landmark ruling. This is from Bloomberg by Jenny Leonard. And this basically takes us from, we talked about the history, we talked about the potential consequences, and now we're going to talk about where do we go from here? What can we do about this? So I want to hear everything that you all have to say. Where do we go with something like this?
So Biden did push the Senate to actually do a vote. I believe the vote as of this recording was done today. However, it was not enough to overturn the filibuster. I believe it was like 51 to 49. Yeah, 51 to 49, if I'm not mistaken. So so unfortunately, we were not able to get a proper vote per se, just to get a simple majority because of, the 60-40 rule that's currently in the Senate right now. So that is unfortunate. However, there are other states in of themselves that are what they call I would call them sanctuary states for abortion. My state is one of them. I believe that one of the articles that is actually there for reading talks about how different governors have responded to the leak from the SCOTUS. Governor Pritzker of Illinois actually stated in one of his addresses that we believe women and we were going to protect them, and has promised that abortion and also reproductive rights will never be overturned in Illinois. Well, I don't know if we can say never, but just like under his watch, right? I believe that there was the Washington state governor pretty much promised to do the same thing as far as like defending abortion and reproductive rights. So that is something that we are seeing in some of the other states, but it happens to be in the minority because, like, of course, as we were talking about the other trigger laws that were happening in over 20 to 22 plus states, this is not the case. So it's something that we just have to keep in mind as far as like some of the responses. I'm curious, MD Aware or Dr. Hafer, what do you have to say about where do we go from here?
I mean, so I've been reading up a bit on this. And as you alluded to, Cynthia, Roe v. Wade initially came from the 14th Amendment, and specifically having to do with the right to privacy, which I think is kind of funny, because it's not really the point of Roe v. Wade, right? It seems like it was sort of a backdoor way of getting this, of interpreting existing amendments to the Constitution in a way that upheld women's rights and the right to sort of bodily autonomy. If it were, if I were an American politician, I would be pushing for a constitutional amendment that formally recognized the right to bodily autonomy, for instance. I think that that's something that should be explicit, and it's something that, again, we have in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is sort of comparable document. And I think that it's very strange that this right to abortion had to come through this like right to privacy. I don't know why. Like, I think that maybe I'm being naive. I'm sure I'm being naive. I don't know why an amendment to the Constitution that ensured the right to bodily autonomy or enshrined the right to bodily autonomy as a constitutional right, I think that would be difficult to argue against in many cases, because it seems to be a broadly held belief. And I think even pro-life movement would agree with many circumstances outside of abortion where you have right to bodily autonomy, right? And so I think I would approach it from that perspective personally.
It's kind of funny how like we have this whole conversation concerning bodily autonomy, and that is exactly what the same group was saying when they did not want to take a vaccine or wear a mask.
Right, exactly.
You know, my body, my rights. Weird. Dr. Hafer?
Yeah, well, what I've been thinking for some time is that what we need is a Reproductive Rights Act, similar to the Voting Rights Act back before it got gutted.
Right.
Where basically the states who are the bad actors, who have the record of putting obstacles in place of getting an abortion, basically have to clear their new laws with Congress. So now this, of course, assumes, unfortunately, the right to an abortion. But the point is, if you have that right, which we have for a little while longer, if you have that right, then there should be, as I said, congressional action to actually make sure that that right is practically available. As I said, just like with voting, it does you no good to have the right to vote if you cannot actually vote. If it is restricted in so many ways that it's impossible.
Great point.
If that, failing that, we have to assist women however we can. And I'm going to point out that, this is going to include maybe finding ways of mailing abortion pills to people who cannot have them mailed to them legally. It will include, secret societies providing bus fare if people need to travel out of state. It's going to mean maybe chipping in on legal fees when a woman has a miscarriage. This is something, unfortunately, that I see coming down the road, is that there will be women who actually have miscarriages who will wind up being accused of murder.
Yeah.
And so there are going to be a lot of downstream consequences. And in general, we need to find ways, organized ways of assisting women in whatever way they need it.
Indeed. Ben?
I think one of the most practical ways, like at least adding on to and not overlapping things that other people have said already, but go out there and vote if you're able to vote. Like that includes your local elections. Vote for your judges in your area. Vote for your state officials. Vote for on the federal level. Just vote for all of them, because we get to places like this when people who aren't representing the people have people out there voting for them. Like we know that the majority of people in the U.S. support abortion rights, but the problem is a lot of the problem is the people currently in power do not accurately represent the people, and a lot of them don't care to actually represent the people. So apart from the things that we can't really do as individuals, we can go out there and we can tell them what we want. We can give our votes. And I know that's not an option for everybody. I wish that we had a better infrastructure to where people could have access to voting. That's a whole separate conversation. But if you are able to vote, by all means, you should take advantage of it and do it.
Yeah, and there are other organizations that are actively trying to fight for this on a political level. I know that Freedom from Religion is one of them. Also, the Satanic Temple is one of them as well. And you have a lot of different reproductive rights organizations that are on the front lines that are really working towards making sure that Roe v. Wade is codified in legislation. Actually, the House already passed a bill similar to what you were discussing, Dr. Hafer, back in February of this year. It's just that we just have an issue with the Senate, and a lot of it is because the representation is just not there. And I've said this on previous shows, and I'll say it again, that a lot of times a lot of us who happen to be non-believers may look at the evangelicals, specifically white evangelicals or Christian nationalists, and just think that these people are just loud, right? Loud and wrong. But they may be loud, they may be wrong, but they're fucking organized. And as I stated previously, the whole thing was about trying to make sure that they were able to get their people in power. And now we're here. And with that being said, last piece of, what do we call this? Like the last piece of, the last few announcements that I need to go ahead and say is make sure that you guys join our fan and social media outlets. You can find most of the nonprofits host on the Atheist Community of Discord by going to tiny.cc/ACD Discord and on Facebook at tiny.cc/FBNP. And if you would like to support the show, you can do so by becoming a patron at tiny.cc/PatreonNP. If you find yourself already shopping at Amazon, support the Atheist Community of Austin by shopping at smile.amazon.com and selecting the Atheist Community of Austin as the beneficiary. And be sure to use that link to help out the ACA. We really do appreciate it. And we also value your feedback, everyone. So tell us what you like and what you don't like in the comments below, or you can email us at thenonprofits@atheist-community.org. I will be very interested in getting feedback from our audience members concerning this topic and what your thoughts are, how you're feeling. One of the missions of the ACA is really creating community. And part of that is holding space for one another when something is very troubling in our midst. So I just want to thank our guests for coming on today. Student Dr. Ben, thank you so much for joining. MD Aware, we will thank Truth Wanted for lending you out to us for this particular episode. And Dr. Abby Hafer, thank you so much for joining us. We really do appreciate all of you all's input for this particular show. And everybody, make sure that you take care of each other and yourselves. Thank you for tuning in. You all have a great rest of your Sunday. Bye now.
Watch Talk Heathen live Sundays at 1 p.m. Central. Visit tiny.cc/YTTH and call into the show at 512-991-9242 or connect to the show online at tiny.cc/callth.